Good afternoon, Judge. Today we'll be talking about Cyclops Blink botnet. As we remember, a couple of years ago, there was one botnet VPN filter, which is called VPN filter, and I think it's well known to be orchestrated from the Russian actors. So it kind of targeted various IoT devices in the sense like routers, devices, stuff like those. But earlier this month, I think somewhere in the beginning or mid of February this year, there was a new addition update to VPN filter with the modular updates, and that's been called actually Cyclops Blink. And today we are basically talking about what Cyclops Blink, what we can show it from a network perspective based on some of the C2 ports and from endpoint detection perspective.
Sounds good.
Okay, to start off, there are few C2 ports used by the Cyclops Blink botnet. There are about 8 ports used. And what are those ports? Some are well-known ports. For example, 636 is used for LDAPS, which is a secure version of LDAP. 989 is basically a secure version of FTPS protocol, only used for data control. And another one followed by 99 is FTPS protocol, basically control section of the FTPS protocol. And another one, 992, it's TELNET Protocol or TLS or SSL, followed by 994, basically secure version of Irc. 995, we all know basically it's associated with email and stuff like that, which is for POP3S. Again, it's a secure version of POP3. 3269 is Microsoft GC-ssl. I think it's used by Microsoft Global Catalog for LDAP and SSL connectivity. 84443, it's a well-known alternate HTTPS port, but I think IANA registered service is Pcsync HTTPS. That's a quick background out what these ports and what well-known ports associated with either by IANA and most frequently used by various services. This is the view from our common backbone, in the sense of the way network is traversing through our common backbone of AT&T. These are the ports, basically all of the 8 ports mentioned above, how the traffic looks for the past 60 days or so. I think starting from February, how is the volume, how is it acting, stuff like that. Here we are just showing the volume of the ports and how it is acting up. As you can see here, most oftentimes, actually the graph is dominated by 8443, which is a kind of magenta/red color. So it makes sense because that's one of the voluminous ports frequently used compared to these ports. That's why we are seeing lots of that. But even then, if you can see, there's around actually start and mid of February, there is some blue lines basically peaking up, which is related to 3269. So, and again, you see some spikes here and there. The reason I bring up here is that there is usage of this botnet actually in the mid-February, early February. There's a little bit of activity here showing that there might be some increase in one of these ports. Again, you see a little bit of dip around first week of this month, but I'll come back to later. But we'll move on to the next one. Basically, it's the same chart above, but I took out 8443 TCP. The reason is, to see the better view without that graph, how the volume looks like. As I was telling before, basically around the February timeline here, there was a little bit of activity happening on 3269. And again, afterwards, there was some scans, some activity again, and there's actually upsticks with 989 at some point, and again, 636 flow state at some point, and 995. That seems to be increased actually early part of March already. There was increased activity on 3269. You see here the spike here. Basically, at certain points, one of the ports is more dominant compared to the others. That's kind of expected, I think, based on what actions actually those ports are used. Moving on, this is the different view in the sense in this graph, instead of showing the traffic volumes, what we are trying to show is bytes per packet, which is nothing but the payload size of these graphs, these ports. Actually, if you see over here, there's lots of dark green / olive green kind of stuff is more prominent compared to others. What is that port used for? It's 9944. I think there's a lot of activity happened with that port compared to others. But again, 3269 seems to be consistent in the sense there were also activity happening with this one.
I think a good thing to point out that you were mentioning is so this is a bytes per packet count per hour, which is a great chart.
Yeah.
And it just shows everybody how, because part of the malware was they had these ports hard-coded into the malware. And every port was dedicated to a very specific type of traffic. So some ports were simple, keep alives to the C2 server.
Yep.
So you expect that bytes per packet count to be pretty low because you're just sending kind of a ping saying, oh, I'm still here, or hey, I need an update. But when you see like the purple one, so the 3269, which is seems to be pretty voluminous, and even the the green one, right, which is I guess 994, the dark green one. So these could also be handling part of the payload, right? So that could be the reason why there's so much more volume there, so many more bytes per packet. And while you don't see that spike all the time, it's because they're not necessarily updating their malware constantly, right? Whenever there's a new vulnerability or there's something something new that the botnet wants to achieve, they're going to send that set of instructions to the devices, and then the return traffic would be, okay, let's do some recon on the box. Maybe they're collecting information on these routers, right? And then every once in a while, it pushes that load of info back to the command and control.
Basically, like you said, it could be keep alive. After a certain time, the master wants to perform certain actions. It could be gather more information about the botnets, part of the botnet devices, as well as certain actions. Maybe it's instructing to looking for maybe scan for additional devices. Any of these things will be possibilities.
That's true too.
So I think, while even though our view is limited by how much traffic is traversing through our backbone, still it gives a pretty good indicator of what could happen. What our goal is basically, without delving much into deeper analysis, sometimes based on some graphs, we could be able to visualize, maybe make some assumptions. Moving on, what we are doing, it's another type of graph. In this scenario, what we are showing is a scanning, basically scanning happening on these ports. Excuse me. Why scanning? Because there were lots of analysis done by most great people out there, many companies out there. So this information is out there. These are some of the ports used by Cyclops Blink, right? So in order to leverage that, it could be interesting by some researchers, as well maybe some of the botnet operators. They want to recruit additional devices. In order to do that, what will they do? The first thing is recon, as you mentioned. That's what represented by scanning here. What it is here in this scenario, the y-axis scan flows is basically how much volume of scanning happening on this port. Like you see, basically, I think end of February, maybe early of March, actually, the scanning activity kind of picked it up. Like as you can see, there's a big spike compared to the past 60 days or so of traffic. And again, the volume seems to be increased as we entered into the last few weeks. So this is one view of that graph. I mean, this tells you scanning is happening out there because of the interest.
There are some dips in the scanning, and we can clearly see where. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ganesh. I think it was April 6th when the FBI took down majority of the C2s.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
I think sometime last week. I think mid last week. I believe it's April 6th. You're right on that. Basically, most of the C2s were taken down by FBI. We have we have some charts to show it, to what we are seeing, but I think there will be a little bit further down. Moving on, it's basically similar to the scan volumes chart, but in this case, we are measuring the number of unique sources. In the sense, instead of the volume, we're calculating sources. For example, it's a one times a million. Basically, this is basically 1,000 to 1,300 IPs, something like that. That is the calculation here. Again, you see, most oftentimes this reflects the volume, scan volume. And actually, if you compare both the graphs side by side, by taking out the volume of scan shifts, they look exactly the same. You see the spike at the same time. That means the coordinated effort has been going on. There is a definitely interesting scanning done by most of the sources out there. That is what this graph represents. So basically, this graph, the one before this one, represents the scanning activity happening on these ports.
And just to clarify for everybody, like the scanning, this is scanning coming from unique IP addresses, looking on the internet, scanning these very specific ports, and essentially trying to find one of these ports that are listening, and then it will start communicating with that port and continue. Is that what's happening with this?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe this would be initial phase, as you call the recon activity. The first step is you figure out the devices, right? I think next would be, based on the responses probably.
Right.
If any vulnerable devices, they will send some payload, that would be the subsequent steps. But this would be the first step, as you mentioned it.
Yeah. So any devices that are online, communicating with the internet, and have these ports open, these sweeps, essentially, we could call them sweeps too, can pick up those ports that are open, and as soon as they find an open one, they jump right in and start exploiting. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, these ports can be used for different services, right?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Moving on, this is the graph, like you mentioned. We have some takedown happened mid of last week. So I believe the dip here between 405 and 406, I think that is the timeline. Basically, the takedown happened. I think my apologies, I forgot to mention, basically the timeline we are showing in these graphs are based on UTC. So if you calculate the timeline with our Eastern time zone, I think this falls in with the basically takedown efforts. As you can see, there was a drop for some time, but nevertheless, again, actually, we are showing the scan shifts again, unique number of scan shifts. Even though there was a drop, but the scanning activity is still continuing. This means still people are looking for devices. As I was about to mention before, even though these ports being scanned, it doesn't mean that they are vulnerable. It depends upon what kind of devices are there. Yes. For example, 636, 993, they are POP3 versions. They may not be necessarily used by DC2 also. They can be used by most of the email clients. So that needs to be considered also. Okay. But based on the responses, I think the devices can be exploited. And that would be the goal by these scanners.
Yeah, and I think a good way to think of it too is while, during the takedown, what essentially happened was that so the FBI coordinated with other vendors, huge vendors, using their telemetry data, and were able to kind of get a hold of the IP addresses for the majority of the very specifically WatchGuard C2 devices, right, which are essentially people's home routers or firewalls. So WatchGuard is a firewall security appliance. And they were able to tell, okay, we have however many thousand of these WatchGuard appliances, and these are acting as C2 servers. So these were once normal machines that got infected and now became robots, right? So they became bots, and they're distributing the malware. And now they're also doing sweeps. They're also scanning the internet. They're also looking for new recruits. So the moment that they performed this takedown, which was coordinated, right? So they took down, they said, about 30% of the C2 infrastructure. But look how fast. So they took down 30% of the C2, and look, everything dropped. All of the scanning dipped, right? So, or at least, I mean, we could probably zoom in and find, okay, maybe the other 50% was still out there. But while they took the C2s out, the vulnerable boxes were still alive. The vulnerable boxes were still exposed, and they were still, so the ASUS routers and the other WatchGuard devices still had malware on them, still looking around for an available C2 server, still trying to talk to whatever scans were occurring on the internet. And it took maybe a couple hours or maybe a day to grab another one, and then the infection just continued, and then the spike happened again, and we're right back kind of where we were. So it is interesting that it did take the infrastructure down for a little bit, but because they only took the C2s down and they did not remediate the devices that were bots, right? Those bots were now still vulnerable. Right, still vulnerable and becoming C2s themselves, and it's really hard to kind of stop something like this.
The point is the scanning actually shows that it did slow down a little bit, but may not be necessary to Cyclops botnet. But still, that brings up the good point, like you said, even though takedowns are happening at the same time, I think whoever having these devices should patch them as soon as possible. Moving on, again, another view of showing all the scan sets together, including 8443. Again, it's no surprise here. The most number of scanners or maybe scanning is happening on 8443. But again, let's come down to the fag end of the graph here. I think because of the takedown approach, there was significant loss in scanning, maybe scanners on 8443. But again, it picked up. Not as before, but still it's significant enough. I think it kind of reached to these levels, whichever the timeline is, I think start of January. But you see the point, even though it was brief, but again, scanning kind of happening. So it indicates, I think the takedown approach had a huge impact on the scanning. I think bulk of the scanning is coming from the C2 infrastructures.
You can tell right away.
Can be the group. This is basically zooming into after the takedown, how the view is. Talking about basically showing how the takedown approach happened. Like you see, it's start of April, and I think around this timeline, maybe it may not exactly match with the takedown time, but actually the timeline actually shows it. Even though there's a brief again 8443 kind of jumping up, like you see in the 408 timeline, it kind of jumped to about 1,500, 1,600 scanners per hour. Again, actually here you see, even it's a little blip at 407, the blue one is 3269 picked up. Again, the red one is also picked up a little bit, 989. There was a corresponding jump because of that one. But you see that indication here. And coming back to, I think this is as of last night's slide, but you see, what is this purple color? 636 also actually coming up a little bit. So this is the graph basically showing how, like a closer view of, instead of showing the longer view. There's a blip for some time, but again, still we are seeing the activity on it. And to show up, it's a different graph in the sense, it's basically, I believe there were 25 C2 IPs released by one of the shadow servers, right, Josh? I think about around 25, okay. And of the 25, I think there was tracking done by us also. This is one graph basically showing some of those C2 IPs along with the ports we mentioned, the above 8 ports, right? 636, 3269, 8443. As you can see, in the past week or so, how much activity we have seen, and there was some consistent activity with the little spikes here and there. But I think around little after April 4th, there was a dip in activity. I think basically this is showing the C2s which we were tracking have been taken down. that reflected kind of a drop in the traffic, but still there is a traffic. That means actually there's still some C2s out there, which were resilient. Maybe they morphed into something else. So this is one graph different from what all the graphs we showed.
Yeah. This is the clearest, I think, where it shows you that the effect that the takedown had. I mean, and yeah, they did say it was only roughly 40% of C2s, and I think it was a majority of them were WatchGuard machines. So it's still significant. I mean, yeah, it's pretty clear here. And like we said, these are home and SOHO routers and firewalls. So small office, small office, home office equipment, stuff that people working from home now use, or if your company sent you home, sometimes they'll send you a firewall or a router just so that you can VPN into the network.
Right.
Like via hardware rather than just via VPN software. And that that's the equipment that's getting compromised, right? So here you can see a significant drop in that, which this is a clear graph. Yeah. Thank you, Ganesh. This is a good way to explain how we see it, from a network perspective, and how the world is seeing it, and the effect that it's had, even though this is not a tremendous botnet, but we'll get into later how it could possibly become one, especially since the attribution appears to be state-sponsored. It's something to watch out for. All right, so thank you, Ganesh, for getting us going on Cyclops Blink. So since you covered the network portion of it, I'm just going to go over a few slides here. This is a basic, high-level overview of how the malware kind of works. Okay. And the interesting parts of this specific malware, because this type of malware has been around for a while, but I find a few pieces of this specific one that people should kind of know about and see where we're going with botnets nowadays. So right now, the information that's out there, right, and the information in the articles that are focused on Cyclops Blink by the UK and Trend Micro, they're only seeing information on ASUS devices and WatchGuard fireboxes, right? So these are both security appliances, and what that means is these are not massively commercial boxes that are used in huge companies, right? These are like ASUS routers everybody knows about, right? So you buy a Wi-Fi box, a Wi-Fi router, and this is what this malware is targeting very specifically. So. And the range of ASUS routers goes back to a router I still have in my closet, the AC68U, which is well known by a lot of people who like to hack their routers and download new firmware, right? Because you don't want to be locked down by the vendor, but the vendors embrace that, and they've allowed people to flash their routers with certain software that opens up the potential, right, to do more, like create VPNs. And WatchGuard is similar. WatchGuard, I would say, is a level above ASUS, where you would see WatchGuard firewalls more like in a small office environment, like doctor's offices, like small stores, right? Like a hardware store, or like a mechanic shop, anywhere that requires internet access, and wants a little bit more security. And it's good to see that in these small, because a lot of people take it, they don't understand that by dumping like an ASUS router or something in a place where you have information that's PII and SPI for your customers, you could potentially lose that, right, if you're not secure. So having something like WatchGuard is a step above the usual home router you can buy in any big box store. So here we'll focus on the ASUS and WatchGuard vulnerability here. And from the information we have now and what you explained before, this appears to be state-sponsored, right? It appears to be related to Russian state-sponsored APT. Anytime we see that, right, we get a little concerned, because we know that it's usually targeted, and the target this time is interesting because it's not targeting critical organizations or infrastructure. So it's not targeting like huge, utility companies or telecom or anything large like that, right? Any large infrastructure, not targeting government. It's targeting these small little Asus, tiny little home routers, right? That, it's really not a tremendous thing. And there isn't a lot of this out there right now. And that was shown on your slides. While the actual slides do show peaks, if you look at the actual numbers, it's like in the thousands, right? It's not, we're not talking about billions of devices that are compromised here.
Yeah, that's right.
The IPs, 25 to 100 IPs. It's not a lot of IPs. So, and for something that's been around since 2019, which is a fairly long time in malware days, right? It's interesting that this is happening. So all you can think about is they're building this botnet right now on the down low, like kind of trying to be quiet about it, just getting these bots online. We've seen this before with other botnets, but they're getting these bots online and ready to take commands. And right now, what they've seen is the only commands that they're taking is specifically to infect other machines and just grow the botnet. So I'm going to move on. The malware analysis that was done was pretty good. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but I will kind of cover what's interesting about this malware. And to start, the malware itself, right, is composed of two files here. And these two files are loaded into memory. And the way these files are getting there, I have not found a lot of information as to how these devices are getting popped. But a lot of the remediation steps do include to disable external remote access from the internet. So a lot of people want to be able to remotely access their equipment from the outside, right? Specifically, if you have a small business, you want to access your webcams from the internet, you want to access your, end of month reconciliations, right? If you're home, you're doing your taxes, whatever, you don't want to have to go into the office and boot up a computer. So you just remote through your router or through your firewall by popping open a port on the internet. Popping a port open on your firewall, excuse me, and enabling external remote access. What that does, though, is it opens a port on the device, and those scans you were showing previously, one of those sweeps is going to pick up that port that's open. And when it sees that that port is open, it's going to try to brute force that username and password. I think what's happening here is, and again, there's not a lot of information on how these devices are getting compromised, but a lot of the remediation shows to disable remote external access.
It kind of explains with you what you were explaining in the previous slide, right? They're in the phase of building it. And you also explained this is being used by, small shops. Probably the default configuration should be, the remote access has been enabled. And also, like you explained, it could be from various reasons it's been open. So that's a good point in the sense, actually. Yeah. To make, some look at it, how it has been open.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, Ganesh, is we always talk about on this channel, disable external access. You don't need, there are other ways for you to access your equipment remotely, right? There's a way to set up a VPN. Right. You can use cert, so you can use just use a long password. Don't use admin. A lot of the stuff I was reading on the remediation says that on the Asus and on this, although I don't believe it on the Asus side, because with my experience on the older Asus equipment, it was default open for remote administration, right? Now they've turned off the default, but what's happening is, since everybody's doing stuff at home, we have a lot of people getting help desk requests right from their house, and a lot of the help desk technicians are having trouble getting into the network into people's homes, and they're probably requesting them, hey, I need access. Here's the quickest way to do it. Just turn on remote admin, to admin, change the password to helpdesk 123 so I can get in, I can fix your problem, you can get back to work, and then don't forget to disable it. I'm hoping that's what they're telling people, but there's a chance that they're not. Obviously, they're not, right? Obviously, they're not. So this is taking advantage of a lot of what's happening now and how we changed and how the way we work has completely changed.
Got it.
So even the default stuff is not working, apparently. People are still opening up access from the outside. So, yeah, that was a good tangent. So we kind of figured this is how they're getting the malware on the box, right? So they're brute forcing username and password, getting into the machine, and as soon as they have access to the console, you know, they can essentially upload anything they want, right, to the box. And in this case, this malware, sure.
Quick question. Basically, the malware comes as in pairs, like you're showing one as read and executable, another one as read and write, or not necessarily. Do you have any idea? Could you elaborate on that?
What it looks like is it's downloading a file. The file is getting onto whatever equipment, you know, the bad actor is on.
The vulnerable device.
Right, yeah. And it's the actual file has what it seems like 2 segments to the file, and we see 2 different hashes here. You know, the file sizes are exactly the same, which is interesting, right? They're exactly the same file size, but the hashes are completely different.
That's why I asked that question. You know, when I was looking, the sizes seems to be same.
Yeah, and that's why this to me is very interesting, right? Because it's not just the payload is not just one file, right? It's 2, same file name, same size, but one of them has permissions to read and execute, right? And that contains the header for Linux ELF, this is Linux malware, right? Very specifically for Linux operating systems, and Linux is the base default OS on any of these types of appliances, right? Because it's fast, it's very lightweight, and that top file that you see there, that's what executes the code, right? And then the bottom file, secondary file, is for vendor-specific information. And this is where things get interesting. It says victim here, but so each one of these malwares are being deployed very specifically to a vendor, right? So ASUS is going to get their own vendor, their own malware, their own version of the malware.
I mean, it's not uncommon, right? We have seen with lots of IoT partners, they have specific to based on architecture also, like ARM, RISC. So it's not surprising. Yeah.
Yep, it's not. But you can see that they're very specific to the hardware. And like I have written in the bottom, this malware persists in flash memory, and the problem with that is flash memory does not get wiped when you do a factory reset, apparently, at least on the ASUS boxes. So you could do a factory reset, and you're getting the malware, the malicious firmware reinstalled on your router. So just because you hold that button down for 30 seconds, right, and do your reset, you're just resetting the malware right back on the box. And ASUS has very specific instructions. I have links that, you know, we're going to share with everybody that gives you the instructions on how to properly remediate these boxes to avoid reinfecting yourself.
And also the other vendor, I keep forgetting. Actually, they have a tool. Actually, they can use it to basically see whether those devices are infected or not. Right? I think you have that one.
That's correct. Actually, yeah, I don't have it written up here. I do have the link to WatchGuard. Yeah, they do have a tool. And again, that's a slightly bigger company. They have a larger product line, and this tool will detect if your device is infected and help with getting the remediation. That process for the WatchGuard devices, by the way, is a lot more involved than doing the ASUS router remediation.
But at least that gives some indication, right? For example, a user doesn't know, he has done all the steps, still he doesn't know whether it's been gotten rid of the malware or not. Probably a tool like that will help them basically. You know, okay, I'm good now. Oh, if not, you know, you reach out for additional help or something. You know, anything could be done.
That's exactly the point. Yeah, you spend 2 hours remediating all of your equipment. You can run a fresh scan again using their software, get a report saying you're all good, and that helps everybody, right?
True.
So, all right, so this pretty much just is part of the malware. I'll move on to just how they split the malware up, and like you say, Ganesh, it is very reminiscent of what's out there now and how malware works. But essentially, this one is kind of broken up into modules. and a lot of malware that's out there right now that is part of botnets is run similar, but I found this one pretty interesting. So the first module it's running when the malware executes is a system recon module, right? So it's getting the version information, right, of the OS, the hardware information, which is sysinfo. Stat VFS wants to know the file system that's currently on there. The if name index is all the network information on the box. How many ports does it have? What's the IP address schema? What's the, what network is it on? What protocols are running? All of this info helps the C2 deliver the proper payload to the proper port, and it also helps kind of stage the malware for this specific device, and helps them with future infections, right? If it matches on another device, oh yeah, we've already seen a device that matched this info. Here's what we use. The second module is essentially enabling download and upload of files to the device. This is probably where we see we've seen the spike in the data transfer
payload.
In the payload, right? So this module, and again, these modules, from what I'm reading, some of these modules open up very specific TCP pipes, right, for this data, and it will transmit the data on specific channels dedicated just to that data, right? So downloading and uploading of files will flow down one port, right, which is like we saw. That's probably the higher number of bytes per device per event. Sorry.
But George, do you think based on the architecture, maybe in this case only two variants, right, Asus and FireGuard? So maybe each variant might have different C2 port, maybe combination of both. It's possible, right?
I think so. Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's very possible. Maybe because they hard coded. I think they hard coded like 8 ports into the code. Right, something like that. And the ports that you had listed there. So yeah, it's possible that that's easier for them to manage from a C2 perspective, right? So they're listening on these 2 ports for Asus, these 2 for watch, for the other one. And then the other module, is the C2 server IP. So essentially the file you got with IP addresses, this is a dynamic file, right? This is the rootfs CFG file. This file gets updated constantly. Anytime there's a new C2 server out there on the internet, it gets dumped onto this bot, and they update that list. And this is the list of servers that this specific compromised machine is looking for its instructions, right?
I see.
And then the final module is probably one of the most interesting ones, is how it hides itself and becomes persistent throughout the firmware update process. So typically, back in the day, you used to be able to just hit the reset button, or just go to your manager on the device and hit update software, update firmware, and it'll download the most recent version of the firmware from a server controlled by the manufacturer, right, by the vendor. Here, what's happening is the malware itself is directing you to a different server for the update. So even though you're clicking that update button, everything looks like it does normally, right? Matter of fact, and I'll show that here. They're not even deleting the previous process. They're simply moving it to a different folder. When the user clicks update firmware, it's going to do a check, right? It's going to perform a check. wupgrade-dl is the actual firmware upgrade file that the system uses. So everything here is including what you're seeing here. So if it does a check and it does find that file exists on it, right? The next step is it takes the install upgrade CPD. And remember, CPD was the name of the malware. I don't know if you remember. That's the exact name of the malware.
Yeah.
So they named it the exact name of the actual firmware that the companies use, that the vendors are using.
Oh.
So they take the original files and they're just moving them to a different path. So they're not even deleting, they're keeping them, right? So they're moving them to a different directory or copying them over, right? And then there is an install_upgrade, right? Remember, that was the original name of the actual upgrade firmware file. But this time, this is the malicious version of it, right? So this one is executed in place of the factory version, right? And it's because they're still using the same mechanism, the same firmware upgrade mechanism, it's running as a legitimate process on the machine. So it's not flagging itself as as something strange, right? It's the legitimate install upgrade process. But it's in actuality unpacking the malicious firmware image, right? It's unpacking Cyclops Blink. And here it repacks the firmware image. The file system now contains Cyclops Blink. The HMAC value has been updated so that the image passes verification. So it's legitimizing itself using existing processes within the update process.
So because HMAC value is hard-coded, they're basically exploiting it to match it to pass through that check, right?
That's it, yeah. And actually recalculating that value to verify
to match actually and pass through it. Okay, got
it. And then at the end of it all, it executes a legitimate install upgrade process, right, to complete. But it's already gotten the latest version, right? So it's going to perform its checks and say, oh, it's we see you've already gotten the latest version of the firmware. Thank you for trying, but you no longer need to upgrade. That completes the process.
That's great, George, going through the process of this botnet. But like as you're showing here, these are some of the links, remediation links, as well as some additional info can be found from National Cybersecurity Center, which have a good write-up. And WatchGuard, basically, I think this is where they're providing the instructions to verify specific device has been vulnerable or not. And as you said, basically, there are also some link from the bleeping computer. I would also, even though it's not here, I would also add, I think Shadow Server also has a good write-up linking to Trend Micro and National Cybersecurity. Yeah, I think these all will provide basically with our analysis, basically without digging deeper into, we kind of walk through how we can pivot from the network point of view by showing the network traffic based on ports and some additional details from you.
Yeah, so you said it. I mean, it's an interesting piece of malware, and I think we're going to be hearing more about it in the recent future. It's a little scary, but we should definitely keep an eye out.
Yeah, sure. I think if we find any additional information, probably we should follow up like an update to this Cyclops botnet at some point. I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, and there was one thing I wanted to add, going back to how the remediation takes place. And this is true for both pretty much, but more for WatchGuard. Because this kind of embeds itself into the restore process, into the firmware upgrade process, you essentially have to start from scratch when it comes to WatchGuard. So any configuration files you created, they very specifically state you cannot reuse any of the configuration files. So you have to essentially build your configuration from scratch because it will cause your machine to be reinfected. And ASUS has a few different steps to take.
Yeah, that makes sense because as you explained it, this is relying on the basically firmware update process, right? So by starting from the scratch, you kind of eliminating that.
Yep, and the good thing would be, I would say, just when it comes to the ASUS gear, I would say don't even trust their firmware update process. You can go right to their website and you can download the firmware. You can actually download the firmware from their website and manually load it into the device, which is probably the best way to do it, which they do allow. So that's a good second way to navigate that.